Okay, so here's a question that's been bouncing around my head for a while now. How does an actress go from being everywhere in the conversation about a movie to not being in the movie at all? Like, not a cameo, not a blink and you'll miss it moment, just completely absent. Gone. As if the whole thing was a fever dream the internet collectively had. Because that's basically what happened with Sydney Sweeney in The Devil Wears Prada 2. And the wild part, the really wild part, the confusion wasn't random. It wasn't baseless. There were photos. There was context. There was the kind of circumstantial evidence that in 2024 and 2025, the internet will absolutely treat as gospel. And it did. For months, people were certain she was in this film. Fan accounts were treating it like a confirmed casting. Comment sections were debating what her role would be, how big it would be, whether she'd be the new Andrea or the new Emily. And then she wasn't. So today I want to actually unpack this, because there's a real story here about how Hollywood rumors work, about how the internet processes set photos, about why The Devil Wears Prada 2 is still one of the most fascinating projects in development right now, even with all the noise, and honestly, about why Sydney Sweeney's name alone carries enough cultural weight to start a firestorm like this. Let's get into it. All right, so rewind a little bit, because this didn't start with nothing. When production on The Devil Wears Prada 2 began to ramp up, and look, even that was a massive deal, because this is a sequel that people have been whispering about for nearly 2 decades. The internet did what the internet always does. It went hunting. Fans, photographers, entertainment accounts, everyone with a camera and a Twitter account descended on set locations trying to catch glimpses of what was happening. And at some point, Sydney Sweeney was photographed in an area connected to the production. Now, and this is where it gets interesting, being near a film production in a major city doesn't mean you're in that film. Film crews are sprawling. Sets bleed into neighborhoods. People visit people. Coincidences happen. But none of that nuance matters when the person in question is Sydney Sweeney, who at this point is arguably the most talked about actress on the planet. The photos spread instantly, and the framing around them, the way they were captioned, the way they were shared, created this immediate assumption. She's in the film. She must be in the film. Why else would she be there? And here's what's fascinating to me as someone who watches how this stuff spreads. The rumor didn't need any more fuel than that. Because once a few prominent entertainment accounts picked it up with that kind of certainty, it became self-reinforcing. People started building on top of the assumption rather than questioning it. Articles were written about her reported role. Fan edits started appearing. People were already speculating about whether she'd have chemistry with Meryl Streep. The internet had essentially cast her, written her arc, and decided she was a scene stealer, all based on a photograph outside a building. That's the world we live in now. And honestly, I find it kind of fascinating and kind of terrifying in equal measure as, oh, here's where the story takes a turn. And I want to be honest with you, because when I first heard this confirmed, there was a part of me that had to sit with it for a second. Not because I was devastated or anything, more because it made me realize just how completely the internet had sold itself on a story that wasn't real. Sydney Sweeney is not in The Devil Wears Prada 2. Not in the cut we're going to see. Not in any official capacity that's been confirmed by the studio, by her representatives, or by the film's creative team. The whole thing was, in the most Hollywood way possible, a case of speculation running so fast it lapped the truth. Now, and I want to be careful here because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Not in the final film doesn't necessarily mean was never considered. And that distinction matters a lot, because Hollywood is littered with stories of actors who were in talks, who visited sets, who were photographed near productions, and who ultimately didn't end up in the project for any number of reasons. Creative direction shifts, schedules conflict, roles get rewritten or removed entirely. A character that existed in one draft of a script might not make it to the next. This happens constantly. It just usually doesn't get weaponized into a viral internet narrative because usually the actress in question isn't Sydney Sweeney. Okay, so now I want to get into what I actually think is going on here, because there are a few different theories floating around, and some of them are more plausible than others. Theory 1. She was considered at some point, and it just didn't happen. This is honestly the most boring explanation, but probably the most likely. Studios cast wide nets early in development. They have conversations with agents, they float names, they do chemistry reads and exploratory meetings that never go anywhere. Sydney Sweeney is hot right now. Every studio wants her attached to something, so it wouldn't shock me at all if her name was in a room during early conversations about this sequel. That doesn't mean she was cast. That doesn't mean she agreed. It just means her name was there, and somehow fragments of that made it into the ecosystem. Theory 2, and this one's more cynical but worth entertaining. Could this have been deliberate misdirection? Studios aren't naive about the internet. They know that set photos leak. They know that proximity to a production creates assumptions. Is it possible that having someone like Sydney Sweeney photographed near the production generated a specific kind of buzz that the studio wasn't exactly rushing to correct? I'm not saying they orchestrated it, but I'm also not saying they were devastated by the attention it brought to a sequel that already had enormous anticipation behind it. And Theory 3, which is my personal favorite to think about, could we see her in a potential third film? Because look, if Prada 2 performs the way everyone expects it to at the box office, this becomes a franchise conversation almost immediately. And Sydney Sweeney has now been attached to this world in the public imagination, whether it was intentional or not. That's not nothing. Studios pay attention to that kind of thing. But here's what I think is getting lost in all of this, and I genuinely mean this. The Devil Wears Prada 2 is an enormously interesting project even without the Sydney Sweeney angle. Like, step back from the noise for a second and look at what this film actually represents. Meryl Streep returning as Miranda Priestly. That alone is cinematic event territory. Miranda Priestly is one of the great screen characters of the 21st century. Cold, precise, terrifying, and somehow magnetic in a way that makes you root for her even when she's being monstrous. Bringing her back in 2025, in a media landscape that's been completely transformed by digital fashion, social media, influencer culture, is genuinely rich territory for a story. The fashion industry has changed in ways that the original film couldn't have imagined. The conversation about who holds power in that world, who gets to define taste, how the internet has democratized and simultaneously destroyed the gatekeeping that Runway magazine represented. That's fascinating dramatic material. And if the script is smart enough to engage with those themes, this isn't just a nostalgia play. It could actually be something with real teeth. Emily Blunt's potential involvement, which has been more credibly discussed, adds another dimension entirely. Watching Emily's character navigate a fashion world that's evolved around her, there's real dramatic potential there. The confirmed returning cast and the new additions suggest a film that's trying to honor the original while pushing the story somewhere genuinely new. And the box office expectations are sky high. The original Devil Wears Prada is one of those rare films that has only grown in cultural relevance since it was released. It gets rediscovered constantly. It lives on streaming. It gets quote-tweeted. It gets referenced in conversations about ambition and womanhood and career sacrifice in ways that feel more resonant now than they did in 2006. A sequel to that film, a good sequel, has genuine commercial and cultural upside. And then there's Sydney Sweeney herself, who, let's be honest, deserves a moment in this conversation that isn't about a movie she's not in. The fact that her name near a production location was enough to send the internet into a spiral tells you everything about where she is right now as a cultural figure. She came out of Euphoria with this incredibly nuanced, emotionally complex performance. She's been smart about the project she picks, and she's built a kind of public persona that generates genuine fascination. People are invested in her. They want to see her in things, big things, prestige things, franchise things. And that hunger is going to get satisfied eventually. Whether it's Prada 2 or something else entirely. She's one of those actresses who's clearly on a trajectory toward genuine tentpole stardom. The rumor mill around her isn't going to slow down. If anything, it's going to accelerate that. Oh, what do you do with all of this? You step back. You appreciate the story, the real one, not the one the internet invented. A sequel to one of the most beloved films of a generation is actually happening, with one of the greatest actresses alive returning to a role that defined a cultural moment. That's the headline. Everything else is static. But the static is interesting too, because it tells us something real about how we consume entertainment now, how quickly collective imagination can outpace actual facts, and how certain names have become so charged with expectation that their mere proximity to something is enough to reshape the narrative entirely. Sydney Sweeney wasn't in The Devil Wears Prada 2, but in a way, she kind of was, at least in the version of the movie that lived in everyone's head for a little while. And honestly, that version sounded pretty good.